Good morning, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and these are notes for Chapter 15, Section 2, the Northern Renaissance. You're going to need your packet that you received the other day over Chapter 15 to fill this information in. So please follow along. All right, Section 2 of the Northern Renaissance. We're going to talk a little bit about basically things that were happening in parts of Germany and the Netherlands. But the Renaissance spread north to Northern Europe through trade, travel of artists and scholars between Italy and the north. And then there was this guy named Johannes Gutenberg, who developed what is now known as the printing press. Though I will say this, he was not the first. The Chinese had kind of beaten him to this years before, but he was the first one to bring it to Europe. And as a result of this made bookmaking far more efficient. Artists fled to Northern Europe to escape some of the violent clashes between northern monarchs and the wealthy Italian cities. And by moving there, they took their art to other groups of people. War helped spread humanist ideas, and we talked a little bit about the humanists yesterday. They talked a little bit about the worth and dignity of all people. And so their arts and ideas spread into Northern Europe, and this was assisted because of Gutenberg's printing press. And as we haven't mentioned, that printing press was unique because it had movable type. This allowed for text to be printed at a very quick and rapid pace. It made books more affordable. Humanists in Northern Europe also believed that the church could be reformed through humanist learning and also Bible study. And this is going to bring about a change that we're going to eventually talk about probably in our next section or two, the Protestant Reformation, the reform of Christianity. Moving on. Number 5 and number 6. We're going to talk about probably two of the better known scholars of this era time. And what's interesting is these two gentlemen actually kind of knew of one another and kind of paid homage to one another in their writings. We're going to start first of all with Desiderius Erasmus, who wrote a work known as The Praise of Folly. The thing to know about Erasmus before you go on too much further here is that Erasmus was Dutch, and he had actually been trained as a priest over the years. Matter of fact, when it kind of came time to, kind of start talking about reforms in the church, this is a man who really, in his lifetime, pretty much recognized the authority of the Pope and understood the place of the church. But as some of our Protestants, particularly Martin Luther, became a little more vocal, Erasmus, for the most part, kept his distance from him and did not necessarily advocate some of the things that he had to say. But within this praise of folly, Erasmus criticizes some of the popes of the Renaissance. He thought they were becoming very corrupt. You'll hear a little bit more about that in our next section. His writings, in some cases, fanned the flames of discontent among those who saw corruption within the Catholic Church. I will say this, Praise and Folly is kind of a satire, and it kind of attacked superstitions and some traditions of the people of Europe. And what's interesting is Erasmus dedicated this book to Sir Thomas More, who we're going to mention here. Sir Thomas More wrote a work called Utopia, and Utopia was basically, I don't want to say it was like fiction, but there's a little element of that there. He wrote about a political system of an ideal imaginary island. And for the most part, it criticized the English government. It describes a perfect society based on reason. Sir Thomas More was kind of a beloved man. He had actually been the Lord Chancellor to Henry VIII. But, as all good things come to an end, he was tried for treason and, for the most part, executed when he refused to see Henry VIII as the head of the Church of England. Sir Thomas More would eventually be canonized and he would be known as St. Thomas More. All right, in our final stretch here, we're also going to talk a little bit about some English playwrights. I think most of you at some point in time have heard and read some of the works of this guy named William Shakespeare. Shakespeare and one of his closest rivals, a man named Christopher Marlowe, probably were two of the most famous writers that came out of England during this time of the Renaissance. And what's interesting is these guys were crossing paths really quite often. And if you look at the pictures of these two gentlemen over here to the side, uh, they really do look quite alike. You know, almost like they could be brothers or something. But nevertheless, Marlowe and Shakespeare, they came from the same town. They lived at the same time. They had the same occupation. And crazily enough, they worked with some of the same people. What's different is their backgrounds. William Shakespeare was probably more of a commoner than Christopher Marlowe. Marlowe was educated, while Shakespeare was not. Marlowe was fluent in foreign languages, Shakespeare was not. And Marlowe had traveled quite frequently, and, well, Shakespeare had not. So even though they may have a lot in common, there are some little differences there. There has been times when scholars have said that some of the works of Shakespeare were actually probably the works of Christopher Marlowe. Um, I don't know how much proof we have about that, but supposedly, you know, there are people out there that doubt whether Shakespeare wrote all the works that he did. All right, and the final stretch, oil painting allowed for artists such as Jan van Eyck to paint more vivid colors and correct the work that they had on canvas. And artists in Northern Europe, like Peter Bruegel, painted mainly realistic portraits, landscapes from scenes from daily life, like the one that you see here. It looks like we have some hunters that are coming back to their snowy village. You can see some people ice skating out on the lakes. All right, well, thank you very much. Make sure that you get everything written down, and we will see you soon.